In the year 1221, the most terrifying force the world had ever seen was carving a path of destruction across Central Asia. The Mongol Empire, led by the legendary Genghis Khan, had already conquered kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Their horse archers moved like a storm across the steppes, their composite bows raining death from impossible distances. No army had found a way to stop them. City after city had fallen. Millions had perished. The very mention of the Mongol horde sent entire populations fleeing in terror. But in the mountain passes of Afghanistan, one man was about to do the impossible. His name was Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, and he commanded an army that would shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility. This is the story of the Battle of Parwan, where 30,000 foot soldiers armed with nothing but bows and unbreakable will stood against the greatest cavalry force in history and won. To understand the magnitude of what happened at Parwan, we need to go back to the beginning of this catastrophe. The Khwarezmian Empire had been one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. Stretching from present-day Iran through Central Asia, it controlled the vital trade routes of the Silk Road. Its cities were centers of learning, culture, and immense wealth. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench were names that inspired awe throughout the medieval world. The Shah of Khwarezm, Muhammad II, ruled over perhaps 5 million people, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and sat on a throne that seemed unshakable. Then came the caravans. In 1218, Genghis Khan had sent a trade mission to Khwarezm. The Mongol leader, having just finished his conquest of northern China, was looking to establish peaceful commercial relations with his western neighbors. It was a test, perhaps, but also a genuine offer. The caravan consisted of around 450 merchants carrying gold, silver, silk, and other precious goods.
When they arrived at the border town of Otrar, the local governor, Inalchuk, made a decision that would doom millions. He accused the merchants of being spies, confiscated their goods, and executed them all. One survivor managed to escape and bring word back to Genghis Khan. The Mongol leader, never one to let an insult pass, sent ambassadors to Shah Muhammad demanding that Inalchuk be handed over for punishment. The Shah's response was even more catastrophic. He had the lead ambassador killed and sent the others back with their beards shaved, a profound insult in both Mongol and Islamic culture. Genghis Khan had been willing to trade. Now he would make an example that would echo through the ages. "I am the punishment of God," he reportedly declared. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm began in 1219 with a force of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors. But this was no ordinary army. The Mongols had perfected a system of warfare that combined incredible mobility with devastating tactical flexibility. Every warrior was a horseman, and every horseman carried multiple horses, allowing them to cover distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. They could travel up to 100 miles in a single day when necessary, living off the land and the blood of their horses when supplies ran low. Their composite bows, made from horn, wood, and sinew, could pierce armor at 200 yards. They fought in coordinated units that responded to signals with practiced precision, executing complex maneuvers that European and Asian armies would not match for centuries. But their greatest weapon was psychological warfare. The Mongols had a deliberate policy of absolute terror. Cities that surrendered immediately were often spared and incorporated into the empire with relatively light taxation. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Not just defeated, annihilated. When Bukhara fell in 1220, Genghis Khan himself rode into the city's grand mosque and declared to the assembled notables, "I am the flail of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The city was systematically looted. Those with useful skills were enslaved, the rest were killed or driven out. The same pattern repeated at Samarkand, Urgench, Nishapur, Merv, and Herat. At Nishapur, after a Mongol commander was killed during the siege, they reportedly counted the heads of the dead. 1,700,000 people. At Merv, perhaps the greatest city in Central Asia, estimates run even higher. Shah Muhammad II, commanding armies that on paper outnumbered the Mongols several times over, made a fatal strategic error. Instead of concentrating his forces for a decisive battle, he scattered them in garrisons across his empire. The Mongols, operating with superior intelligence networks and mobility, defeated these scattered forces one by one. The Shah himself fled before the Mongol advance, chased by a flying column led by two of Genghis Khan's most capable generals, Jebi and Subutai. These 20,000 riders pursued the Shah across Persia into the Caucasus and around the Caspian Sea, defeating multiple armies along the way in what would become one of history's greatest cavalry raids. Shah Muhammad died in 1220, a broken man hiding on an island in the Caspian, his empire in ruins, his legacy a cautionary tale about pride and poor judgment. But the Shah had a son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, whose name meant Majesty of the Faith, Son of the Sun, was cut from different cloth than his father. While Shah Muhammad had fled, Jalal ad-Din had fought. He had defended the city of Urgench against the Mongols in a brutal siege that lasted for months. When the city finally fell, he escaped with a corps of loyal warriors and continued the resistance. Unlike his father, Jalal ad-Din understood that the only way to fight the Mongols was to deny them their advantages. The Mongol cavalry dominated open terrain where they could maneuver and use their superior archery. They struggled in mountains, in cities, and in any situation where their mobility was constrained. By 1221, Jalal ad-Din had managed to gather an army of around 60,000 men. This was no easy feat. The Khwarezmian Empire had been shattered. Cities lay in ruins. The population was scattered, traumatized, living in constant fear of Mongol patrols. But Jalal ad-Din had something his father lacked: courage and the ability to inspire loyalty in desperate times. His army was a mixed force. There were Turkish cavalry, survivors of the Shah's once mighty military machine. There were Afghan tribesmen from the mountains, fierce warriors who knew their terrain intimately. There were volunteers from across the Islamic world who saw in Jalal ad-Din a chance to strike back against the seemingly invincible invaders. And most importantly for what was to come, there were approximately 30,000 infantry archers. The Mongols, meanwhile, had divided their forces to complete the conquest of Khwarezm and pursue various objectives. One of the main Mongol armies, estimated at between 30 and 50,000 warriors, was operating in Afghanistan under several commanders. These were men who had conquered kingdoms, who had never known defeat, who viewed the remnants of Khwarezmian resistance as a minor cleanup operation before moving on to new conquests. They were about to receive a harsh education. Jalal ad-Din chose his ground carefully. The Parwan Valley, located north of present-day Kabul, was perfect for his purposes. It was a relatively narrow area, flanked by mountains and hills, terrain that would constrain the Mongol cavalry's ability to maneuver. The date was somewhere in the late summer or early autumn of 1221. The exact day is lost to history, but what happened there would be remembered for centuries. As the Mongol army approached, Jalal ad-Din arranged his forces in a defensive position. He placed his 30,000 archers, most of them infantry, in the center and on elevated ground. These men carried composite bows similar to the Mongols' own weapons, though perhaps not quite as powerful. But they had one crucial advantage. They didn't need to control a horse while shooting. On the flanks, Jalal ad-Din positioned his cavalry, including heavy cavalry equipped with lances and swords for close combat. These were his mobile reserve, ready to exploit any opportunity or shore up any weakness in the line. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. The Mongols relied on their mobility and their archery to wear down opponents from a distance, then close in for the kill once the enemy formation broke. Jalal ad-Din was going to turn their own tactics against them. His archers would outshoot the Mongol horse archers, and his defensive position would force the Mongols to attack on his terms. The Mongol commanders, confident from years of unbroken victory, apparently did not take Jalal ad-Din's army seriously enough. They had defeated larger forces before. They had crushed the armies of the Jin dynasty in China, armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They had broken the proud warriors of the Khwarezmian Empire again and again. These remnants under Jalal ad-Din, they assumed, would be no different. They advanced to attack. The Mongol battle plan typically involved multiple phases. First, light cavalry would harass the enemy with arrows, circling at range to avoid direct contact while wearing down the opposing forces. This was the famous Mongol caracole, a rotating system where units would ride in, shoot and withdraw to allow fresh units to take their place. They could maintain this attack for hours, depleting the enemy's stamina and ammunition while staying relatively safe themselves. Once the enemy formation began to waver, showing gaps or signs of disorder, the Mongols would intensify the attack. Heavy cavalry would charge weak points. The light cavalry would continue their harassment from other angles. And if the enemy broke and ran, that's when the slaughter truly began. Mongol horses were faster than most, and fleeing soldiers were easy prey for pursuing cavalry. But here is where the tragedy of history reveals itself. Victory in battle does not always translate to victory in war. Jalal ad-Din's triumph at Parwan would prove to be a bright, brief flame in the darkness rather than the turning of the tide. The problems that had doomed his father's empire still existed. The Mongols still had vast reserves of troops. Genghis Khan himself was in the region with the main Mongol army, and he was not about to let this defeat stand unavenged. Moreover, Jalal ad-Din faced internal divisions among his own followers. The various factions in his army, the Turks, the Afghans, the Persians, all had their own agendas and grievances. Unity in the face of victory proved harder to maintain than unity in the face of common danger. Within weeks of the Battle of Parwan, Jalal ad-Din's coalition began to fracture. Disputes over the distribution of spoils, over strategy, over command positions, all the petty and not-so-petty conflicts that plague any army, especially one thrown together in desperation, came to the surface. Some contingents departed, weakening his forces at the exact moment when he needed to consolidate his victory. Meanwhile, the Mongols regrouped. Genghis Khan took personal command of operations against Jalal ad-Din. The message was clear: this upstart prince had embarrassed the Mongol Empire, and there would be consequences. The Mongols gathered their scattered forces and began to hunt Jalal ad-Din with the full weight of their military machine. The final confrontation came at the Battle of the Indus River in 1221, not long after Parwan. Jalal ad-Din, with his reduced and divided army, faced Genghis Khan himself at the head of a much larger Mongol force. This time, there was no mountain valley to constrain Mongol movement. This time, the Mongols were prepared for the tactics that had defeated them at Parwan. This time, they had overwhelming numerical and tactical superiority. The battle was a disaster for Jalal ad-Din. His army was crushed, his followers were killed or scattered, and Jalal ad-Din himself, in one of the most dramatic moments in medieval military history, spurred his horse off a cliff into the Indus River to escape capture. He survived that leap, swimming his horse to the far bank, while Mongol arrows fell around him. Genghis Khan, watching from the opposite shore, reportedly turned to his sons and said, "Every father should wish to have a son like that." Jalal ad-Din would survive for another decade, continuing a wandering resistance against the Mongols, fighting in Persia, in Georgia, in the Middle East, always on the move, never able to rebuild what he had lost. He was killed in 1231 by Kurdish warriors, dying in obscurity far from the empire his father had ruled. The Khwarezmian Empire never recovered. The devastation the Mongols inflicted on Central Asia was so severe that some regions did not fully recover for centuries. Cities that had been centers of learning and culture vanished or were reduced to shadows of their former glory. The population decline from warfare, massacre, and the disruption of agriculture was catastrophic. Yet the Battle of Parwan deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to inevitable Mongol victory, but as a demonstration of what was possible with skill, courage, and the right tactics. Jalal ad-Din proved that the Mongols were not superhuman, not truly invincible. He showed that their tactics had weaknesses that could be exploited by a commander who understood warfare and was willing to fight on his own terms rather than the enemy's. His 30,000-foot archers, standing firm in the face of the most feared cavalry in the world, outshooting and outfighting warriors who had conquered empires, gave the world a lesson in the power of disciplined infantry and the importance of terrain and tactics over simple numerical or technological superiority. The battle also illustrates a crucial principle of military history: tactical victories do not guarantee strategic success. Jalal ad-Din won the battle but lost the war because he lacked the resources, the political unity, and the strategic depth to capitalize on his victory. The Mongols could afford to lose a battle. They had the numbers, the organization, and the ruthless will to come back stronger. Jalal ad-Din had one chance, and while he made the most of it at Parwan, the larger forces of history were against him. This is the bitter truth that faces all commanders who win battles against overwhelming odds. Victory must be exploited immediately, must be turned into political and strategic advantage, or it becomes merely a glorious memory rather than a turning point. The legacy of Parwan lived on in military thinking, though perhaps not always in obvious ways. The idea that foot archers, properly positioned and commanded, could defeat cavalry remained relevant through the medieval period. The English longbowmen at Crécy and Agincourt, the Swiss pike formations, the Hussite wagon forts, all these later developments in infantry tactics owed something to the fundamental principle that Jalal ad-Din had demonstrated: infantry need not be helpless against cavalry if they have the right weapons, the right ground, and the right leadership. The Mongols themselves learned from Parwan. In their later campaigns, they were more cautious when facing defended positions. For the Islamic world, Jalal ad-Din became a symbol of resistance, a hero who had... In the collective memory of the regions ravaged by the Mongol invasions, Parwan represented hope, the proof that courage and skill could triumph even against the most terrible odds. It was a hope that would be needed in the dark centuries to come as the Mongol successor states continued to dominate much of Asia. Today, when we look back at the Battle of Parwan from the perspective of 8 centuries, we can see it clearly for what it was: a remarkable tactical achievement, a victory of intelligence and courage over power and momentum, and ultimately a tragic might have been. If Jalal ad-Din had been able to maintain his coalition, if he had possessed his father's resources without his father's weaknesses, if the political situation had been different, Parwan might have been the beginning of a successful resistance that checked Mongol expansion. Instead, it was a bright moment in a dark time, a victory that could not be repeated or sustained. But that does not diminish what those 30,000 archers accomplished in that Afghan valley in 1221. They faced the storm and held firm. They met the most feared warriors in the world and sent them reeling back in defeat. For one day, they proved that human courage and skill could overcome any advantage, any reputation, any threat. And that is a lesson worth remembering, no matter how the larger story turned out. The weapons and tactics deserve closer examination because they reveal the technical genius of what Jalal ad-Din accomplished. The composite bow used by both the Mongols and the Khwarezmian archers was a marvel of medieval engineering. Made from layers of different materials, typically wood at the core, horn on the belly facing the archer, and sinew on the back, these bows took months or even years to construct properly. The horn compressed when the bow was drawn, storing energy. The sinew stretched, storing even more energy. When released, this combination could propel an arrow with devastating force, capable of penetrating armor at close range and maintaining lethal velocity at distances up to 300 yards or more. The Mongol version was optimized for use on horseback, slightly shorter to allow for easier manipulation while controlling a mount. The Khwarezmian infantry versions could be slightly longer, trading some maneuverability for additional power and range. The arrows themselves were carefully crafted with different head designs for different purposes. Broadheads for unarmored targets, bodkin points for piercing armor, even whistling arrows that made distinctive sounds and were used for signaling. A skilled archer could carry 60 to 80 arrows in his quiver and shoot 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute. More if accuracy was less important than volume of fire. At Parwan, the Khwarezmian archers would have been shooting primarily at horses and unarmored or lightly armored riders. Mongol cavalry did wear armor, often lamellar construction made from small plates laced together, but their horses were generally unarmored. The tactical arrangement at Parwan maximized these advantages. By placing his archers in a fixed position on favorable ground, Jalal ad-Din ensured they had stable shooting platforms and could concentrate their fire. A Mongol horse archer, moving at speed, had to account for his own motion, his horse's motion, and the target's motion. A foot archer needed only to account for the target's motion and could shoot with far greater accuracy. Moreover, the massed archery created zones of death where the arrow density was so high that individual skill mattered less than being in the wrong place. The psychological dimension of the battle was equally important. The Mongols depended heavily on their reputation for invincibility to intimidate opponents into making mistakes or surrendering without a fight. When that reputation met soldiers who refused to be intimidated, who stood their ground and fought with skill and determination, the psychological advantage evaporated. The Khwarezmian archers at Parwan were fighting not just for victory, but for survival, for their families, for their faith, for their very identity as a people. They knew that retreat meant death or enslavement. They knew that the Mongols gave no quarter to those who resisted. So they stood and fought with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. It is worth noting that sources for the Battle of Parwan are limited and sometimes contradictory. Medieval chroniclers, both Islamic and Mongol, recorded the event, but often with different details and interpretations. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing a generation after the events in a work commissioned by the Mongol Ilkhanate, acknowledged the defeat but minimized its significance. The historian Rashid al-Din, also writing under Mongol patronage, provided more details but naturally emphasized the ultimate Mongol victory at the Indus. Islamic sources not written under Mongol rule tended to celebrate Jalal ad-Din's achievements more enthusiastically, sometimes exaggerating the scale of the victory. Modern historians have had to work carefully through these sources, cross-referencing accounts, and looking for the consistent details that appear across multiple traditions. The basic facts are clear. A battle was fought at Parwan. Jalal ad-Din commanded a mixed army that included substantial numbers of foot archers. The Mongols attacked and were repulsed, and this represented a significant if temporary check to Mongol momentum in the region.